Numbers can be written many different ways, and depending on the type of math problem we're working on, it might be more useful for a number to be written as a fraction, or sometimes it's more helpful for it to be written as a decimal. So when we know how to change numbers around and write them in these different formats, it helps us not only to make our problem easier to solve, but it can also save us time when we're solving those problems as well. The three types of numbers that we're going to look at in this lesson are integers, fractions, and decimals. Integers include all of the whole numbers. So we start with 0 and count on to 1, 2, 3, and so on. Integers also include the negatives of those numbers, -1, -2, -3, and so on. They do not include fractions and decimals, though. Fractions and decimals are different types of numbers. And here we can see we have 9/20 as a fraction, and we have -5 and 3/10 as a fraction. So some fractions have an integer part and a fraction part right next to it. Just like we see here, the -5 is an integer and the 3/10 is the fraction part. But all together they make up a mixed fraction. And then we have decimals. Here we have 0.835, or we can read it as 835 thousandths. And then we have the number 24.7, or we can read it as 24 and 7/10. So in this lesson, we're going to take a look at these different numbers and see how we can change them around and write them in different ways. First, we're going to change this decimal to a fraction. We have our 835 thousandths. Our first step to changing this decimal into a fraction is to write the digits after the decimal point as the numerator of the fraction. So we're going to set up a fraction line and put 835 above that fraction line. Our second step is to use the place value of the last digit to determine the denominator of our fraction. So the last digit of our decimal is 5, and it's in the thousandths place. So that tells us that our denominator is going to be 1,000. So now we see we have our decimal number changed into a fraction. And sometimes it is helpful to simplify the fraction, depending on if the problem tells us that it needs to be simplified. So, do 835 and 1,000 have a common factor that we can divide them by? They do. They can both be divided by 5. So if we divide both of those numbers by 5, we will get 147 for the numerator and 200 for the denominator. We can't simplify those numbers anymore, so our final simplified fraction is 147 over 200. For our next example, we're going to change this decimal into a fraction. We have 24.7. Now notice that to the left of the decimal point, we don't have a 0 like we did in the previous example. We actually have the number 24. So 24 is going to become the whole number part of our fraction. So we're setting this up as a mixed fraction. You'll have a whole number, an integer part, and then it's going to have a fraction part next to it. So for now, all we need to do is bring that 24 down, and it's just going to sit there as the integer part of our mixed fraction. Then we're going to look at the 7 that's after the decimal point to set up the fraction part of our mixed fraction. So here are the same 3 steps that we used from our previous example. First, we'll look at the 7 that's after the decimal point, and we're going to make that the numerator of our fraction part. and then we'll look at its place value. Since 7 is the last digit of this decimal, that 7 is going to be the place value that we'll use to determine the denominator. And this 7 is in the tenths place. It represents 7/10. So that tells us that the denominator of our fraction part will become 10. Now, step 3 is to simplify the fraction, but this fraction is already simplified, so we would just leave it as it is. We have 24 and 7/10. Now we'll learn how to convert fractions to decimals. Here we have the fraction 9/20. One thing that's helpful to know about fractions is that they represent division. So we can also look at this as 9 divided by 20. And we're going to use that concept to help us convert this fraction into a decimal. So step 1 is to divide the numerator by the denominator. And we'll do that using long division. Next, for step 2, we'll place a decimal point and a 0 at the end of the dividend, which is the number that's inside of the division symbol. In this case, it's the 9. If we need to, we can always add more zeros after that one, but we won't know until we actually start solving the problem. So we'll see that in a moment. Now, to set up division with a decimal, make sure that you place a decimal point where the quotient will be, which is the answer. So you place a decimal point directly above where the decimal is in the dividend. Now we're ready to start dividing. So we want to see how many times 20 can go into 90. I'm going to ignore the decimal point while we're going through and dividing, while we're figuring out what numbers we need to put in the quotient. So 20 can go into 90 4 times. And then we multiply. 20 times 4 gives us 80. Subtract that, we have a remainder of 10. Now, since we want to have our answer written as a decimal, we don't want to have a remainder. So we're going to keep this division problem going until we have no more remainder left. To do that, we'll add another 0 at the end of our decimal. Bring that 0 down, and now we say 20 goes into 100 how many times? 5 times. And then 20 times 5 gives us 100. We subtract that, and now we have a remainder of 0. And that's how we know when we're finished this division problem, when we have no remainder left. And now if we look at the numbers that we have written in our quotient, we have 0.45. We can add a 0 to the left of that decimal point to make our decimal look more complete. And there's our final decimal answer, 0.45, which we can read as 45 hundredths. Our next fraction is a mixed fraction. We're also going to convert this one to a decimal. Now notice it has that -5 and then the fraction of 3/10 next to it, and that's what makes it a mixed fraction. We have an integer part and a fraction part. First though, we can keep that integer part the same. So we're just going to drag that -5 over. And then we'll focus just on the fraction part, on the 3/10, and convert that part to a decimal. And then we'll put it all together in the end. So now let's focus on the 3/10. We'll follow our same steps to convert 3/10 to a decimal. We'll divide the numerator by the denominator, so 3 divided by 10. We'll add our decimal point and 0. Place a decimal point in the quotient, and now we can start dividing. 10 goes into 30 3 times. 10 times 3 is 30. Subtract. We have a remainder of 0. and that's how we know when we're finished. And now notice that in our quotient we have 0.3. Well, now we're going to combine that 0.3 with the -5 that we had from our original mixed fraction. So now we have -5.3 as our final decimal answer. Now we'll look at converting integers to decimals and fractions. First, we'll focus on this integer. We have positive 38, and we're going to convert it to a decimal. Now the first step is to place a decimal point after the last digit. So we copy that 38 over, place a decimal point after it, and then our next step is to place some zeros after that decimal point. And the number of zeros really depends on the problem that we're working on or the specific situation. We might need just 1 0. We could have 2 zeros, or we could keep going on and add as many zeros at the end as we need to. So for example, if we're working on a problem that's dealing with money, and this 38 represents $38, but we want to represent it as dollars and cents, we would write the 38 with a dollar sign, and then for the cents, we want that to go out 2 place values, out to the hundredths place. So in that case, we would add 2 zeros after the decimal point. And now we'll convert an integer into a fraction. We'll start off with our same integer, 38, and we're going to place that integer in the numerator of our fraction. So we'll draw a fraction line and place 38 up top as the numerator. Our second step is to place the number 1 as the denominator. And that's it. Now our integer is set up as a fraction. And being able to do this is very useful when we're doing different operations with integers and fractions. When we're multiplying and dividing them together, it's really helpful to know how to convert these numbers into different formats. So make sure that you review and practice these skills, because they'll really save you a lot of time when you're doing other problems in the future.